start by so I'm going to start by sharing my screen as usual. Um, so just to outline what we'll be doing today. So we're going to start as usual with our review of last week, and like then we go into our breakout rooms, which at the moment it looks like it'll be one breakout room, and then I'm going to talk about order and inertia, um, two opposite ends of a coin, so to speak, which is what I've been doing every week, looking at two sides of a coin. I'll explain the terms. They're not necessarily the way we normally understand them in standard English. And then we have our break, and then I'll sort of discuss serenity and stagnation, and then we'll have a look at equanimity, distraction, and restlessness. So let's have a look at what we did last week. I'll stop sharing that now. So last week we started by looking at craving. So our tendency to our unenlightened mind's tendency to latch on to things, to long for things and cling to objects, but not just objects, to people, to ideas as well, and how we exaggerate the pleasurable aspects of these things and we underestimate the painful aspects. So we just see the good aspects of like particularly being in romantic relationships, and we don't see that, like, the impermanent nature of relationships and that, and it just gives us a sort of skewed view of them. And then we looked at contentment. So this idea of letting go, of giving up, of enjoying and accepting things as they come and go. So I talked about, I've been talking about this a lot lately, the Blake's eternity, so kissing the joy as it flies and living in eternity's sunrise. So this is very important. It's an important part of my practice at the moment, of just doing that and being able to live out of that little sort of couplet. And then we looked at the secondary afflictions that arise from craving, so avarice. So how we identify happiness with having things, just accumulating things rather than actually using them. So like the example of the person who dies and they find tons of money under their mattress. So now we can just accumulate things and like dying in poverty and or apparent poverty, and just lots of money being found under their mattress. So then we looked at and generosity is an antidote to this, and we looked at that. Then we looked at concealment, deceit, and pretense. So concealment is like we're concealing our own faults with the aim of making somebody think that we're better than we are. Deceit, then we're actively creating a false pretense without actually outright lying, and then pretense is outright telling lies. Like, so it's like a slippery slope, if you like. If we conceal, there's a good chance that we will sort of go along with or end up with outright pretense. So it's the opposite of openness and communication. So that's what we want to try and develop, is a more openness in our communication. And then we looked at hatred and its affliction. So it's hatred is our reaction to suffering, and and our desire to protect ourselves from that suffering. That's often what it is. It's we're reacting against suffering, and when we have this desire to protect ourselves from it, it exaggerates the painful aspects and underestimates the pleasant ones. And then we looked at rage, so we're picking up this stick, and then resentment, so we're nursing a grudge. So we're adding adding fuel to our anger and hatred. And then we looked at spite, so this general grumpiness of disposition. And then we looked at envy, so the displeasure at another's success. And then we looked at the antidote to all of these really was this sympathetic joy. So actually rejoicing in someone else's good fortune. And then we looked at goodwill and metta, and then malice and compassion. And then for the homework last week, there were lots of questions last week. What was there, like 8 questions, so there was a lot to ponder last week. So there were kinds of craving that we might do in our typical day, so the watching out what for types of craving we might do in our typical day. And how we might see this as an attempt to bolster our identities. And just noticing how we might see our partners or objects of romantic interest as real people. Do we actually see them as real people, or as objects to remove the pains of our longing and insecurity? That really gnaws at the root of our identity. And how we deepen our appreciation of them as real people, independent of our needs and securities. So just picking things out at random, like how do we sort of do unhelpful nostalgia, being overly attached and living in memories of the past? Similarly, how are we attached to certain future outcomes? Why might both of these be unhelpful? So that was something to sort of reflect on during the week. Which of these, which of concealment, pretense and deceit are we most subject to? What don't we want to share with people? Because that can be quite telling. Are there situations in which we would be more open, which we can be more open? Can we sort of encourage situations like that in our lives? Are there people with whom we could be more open? So wanting to encourage that kind of situation. So there are a few others. Do we experience hatred as an attempt to destroy something that's causing you suffering? Which of rage, resentment, spite and envy are we most prone to? And how are you working to sort of counteract this? So that's the homework for last week. So I guess you will work with the breakout rooms as best you can work with the breakout rooms, Katie. Let's go for 12 minutes again. There's a lot there to discuss. So I'll see you in 12 minutes time. Okay, it looks like we lost someone along the way. Okay, so let's start. So I'm gonna start talking first about ardor and inertia. So the English word ardor is usually defined as having great enthusiasm or passion or eagerness and zeal. But the way I'm using it's sort of spiritual ardor, and the word that it's been used to translate is a word called virya. So it begins to appear when something called longing faith. So we have faith. None of us would be here at all if there wasn't some sort of faith in sort of drawing us here. So we have this sort of sense of longing faith that's sort of drawing us towards something beyond ourselves. So when this longing faith is strong enough to produce an effective spiritual practice. So that's when this virya arises. So the strength of ardor, so I'm going to use the word ardor rather than virya. So the strength of ardor depends on the strength of our faith. In particular, this longing faith, which closes the gap, if you like, between ourselves and the goal. So the goal in Buddhist terms is enlightenment. So it's not just faith. It's also having the maturity to sort of nurture and channel that faith effectively. So yeah, we can have faith, but like it can just sort of, if we don't do something with it, if we don't have the maturity to sort of help it to grow. Katie and I were talking about houseplants in the break, and like we have to sort of like be able to, like I've a habit of killing plants, like, but I'm learning to try and nurture them, and it's the same with this. Like we have to have the maturity to nurture and channel that faith effectively, and in a sense steer it to clear of conditions that sort of dissipate it, and like and sort of put it into an environment that helps it to grow. So having ardor naturally turns our mind towards more wholesome states of mind. And so we're trying to move from these sort of less wholesome states of mind to more wholesome states of mind. And ardor helps us do that. So for example, if we're trying to meditate, but your mind is drifting towards sense desire, say, which is one of my favourite hindrances when I meditate. My mind will always go naturally towards sense desire. So you notice what's happening, and then you get back in touch with faith. But your sense of confidence that, like with this faith, there's a sense of confidence that meditation works, that it helps you to develop. So you summon up this energy that you need to steer your mind away from the sense desire and back to the object of meditation, be that the breath or be it the sort of metta. And so this surge of energy, if you like, is ardor. But ardor isn't, it's not black and white. It's not just the action of turning from the unskillful to the skillful, the sort of unwholesome to the wholesome. It's also the turning from the skillful to the even more skillful, and the sort of more skillful to the ultimately skillful. So it's a continuum that leads us further and further and further along the path, eventually to enlightenment. So it's not something that we ever let go of. It's something that's always there in our experience as we practice. And like, after all, we can always be even more skillful while we're practicing. And before we reach enlightenment, we can always be more skillful. We never reach a point where until we reach enlightenment, we never reach a point where we sort of, oh yeah, I'm fine, I'm sort of pure, I'm sort of, I'm got skillfulness down pat, like, you know. So virya is sometimes translated as energy in pursuit of the good. But I feel it's probably better to avoid the word energy really altogether. It's too general a word really, and probably too neutral a word. Like we see it all the time around us, like this like energy. There's even sort of breakfast cereals that promise us energy. The ardor is much more specific. So it's a mental force that seeks out the skillful or the more skillful. And it helps us to abandon the unskillful or the less skillful. So it's much broader term than energy. And we can know ardor better by looking at its opposite, which is inertia, which is causidia. So inertia is a moral, and the inertia I'm talking about now is it's not physical inertia, but there can be an element of that. What I'm talking about is a moral and spiritual inertia. So it's a yielding to the inclination to turn away from the skillful to the unskillful or the less skillful. Now, sometimes it's translated as laziness, but that kind of suggests that it's merely the absence of energy. Inertia does include this lack of energy and this sort of lack of physicality, but it also means energy rolling down the path of least resistance, if you can see the difference, the sort of subtlety in this. And inertia is just energy in pursuit of the bad, if you like. So if virya is energy in pursuit of the good, inertia is energy in pursuit of the bad, or just even the mediocre. And from a Buddhist perspective, many energetic activities, such as like accumulating wealth, sort of indulging in pleasure, accumulating power, are actually forms of inertia. They're actually forms of laziness because we're not engaging with the spiritual life. So there are three kinds of inertia according to the tradition that we're talking about. Firstly, there's one traditionally described as the pleasure of lying down and not getting up. And this is one that could really be called laziness. It's the one where you don't get out of bed in the morning to meditate. Instead, just turn over and go back to sleep. And it's probably the most innocent form of inertia, really. But it does have an effect. It's probably one of the main barriers to people getting a regular meditation practice going. So it stops us really, but like it's a real sort of sticky form of inertia. It stops us getting onto the path. Secondly, there's passively allowing yourself to be swept along by the afflictions. So you have some faith, you have some sense of looking along the path and seeing a sense of the positives. But when afflictions arise, so craving or hatred, you tend to let go of the reins a bit. So you sort of like you're going along, you're sort of practicing, and then sort of the afflictions arise. So you get sort of craving comes up, or you get sort of hatred arises, and you just let go of the reins and just go with the craving or go with the hatred. So it's easier to go along with them than to make the spiritual effort to turn them into positives. So people who suffer from this inertia might actually be quite successful and energetic in worldly terms. So Gampopa, a Tibetan teacher, was thinking with this variety when he defined as inertia as destroying enemies, accumulating wealth, and so forth. So you could even call this busy inertia. Gampopa described the likes of destroying enemies, accumulating wealth, and so forth as laziness. So it's spiritual laziness he's talking about. It can even be a headlong rush down the familiar tract cut by greed, hatred, and delusion, without any attempt to lift your head out of them. So the third form of inertia is called the inertia of self-excuse. Probably self-explanatory, really, from the term. But it's the most interesting and revelatory inertia. Its extreme form is despair, but the most common form is letting oneself off the hook for things. In a sense, it's the victim mentality. It arises where we seize on our difficulties in order to absolve ourselves from moral or spiritual effort. It's highly adept at justifying itself. It constructs a story around why it's okay for us to take moral shortcuts or even act outright unskillfully. Okay, so an example is it's okay for me to overindulge in eating loads of bad food today because I've been having really a hard time. So it's okay to eat a load of junk food today because I've been having a really hard time. whatever emotionally or whatever recently. Or it's okay for me to be impatient and rude with the taxi driver at the moment. Today. Because the taxi driver I had the other day was really rude to me, and I found that really upsetting. So it's okay to transfer that to the taxi driver today, which is, of course, is just justification for being rude and impatient. So this kind of inertia is very common, but we need to watch out for it. It kind of nullifies any fate that we may have, any longing fate, this sense of looking up towards or down the path, if you like. So this longing fate, this desire to close the gap between ourselves and the goal, where whatever way we see that goal. What this sort of inertia does, it kind of nullifies this longing fate. It nullifies this gap, closing of the gap between ourselves and the goal. So there's another traditional analysis of inertia that's useful. So inertia is understood as a negative stance towards a spiritual ideal, with 3 varieties. I know there's a lot of stuff here, so I'm going to encourage you again to read the notes and to read the book. Subhuti is very good on this, but it's much more. He gives much more examples, particularly from Shakespeare, as it turns out. But anyway, firstly, there's inertia of cynicism. Cynicism, sort of lack of faith. I was probably one of the most cynical people in the world before I started practicing seriously. So it sees moral principles as merely means to keep people docile and in line, or to console the weak. I think sort of Mark's statement is religion being the opium of the people or the masses. That may be true to some extent, but where it sees morals, when we can see moral principles as in this terms, I think it's that is sort of cynicism. It is inertia. Secondly, there's procrastinating inertia. We accept the spiritual life is necessary and desirable, but we don't want to lead it right now. We put it off for later. I just want to go and party a bit more and get it out of my system, and then I'll be spiritual tomorrow. I've done this at times. I'll go and have a few pints, and I'll meditate tomorrow. I'll be okay tomorrow. This, I think, is it's particularly prevalent in born Buddhists, and people who really believe. Many Western Buddhists don't really connect with the whole idea of rebirth, but in traditionally Buddhist countries, I think this procrastinating inertia is a real problem, because people just see, I can do what I want now because I'll have the next life to do it. We might say, I'll do it tomorrow. But if you have a sense that, I do it next life, it can sort of stagnate a whole life, you can see the problem. But I just want to go and party a bit more now, and I'll get it out of my system, and then I'll be spiritual. It's just as destructive. And this is quite a common thing for people to do. To say, I'll practice tomorrow. I'll go and have fun today and I'll practice tomorrow. Not that practice should be sort of anyway dour or that, but sometimes we have this sort of opinion, we have this sort of sense that practice holds us back from pleasure, and that practice can be pleasurable. Thirdly, there's having a negative stance towards spiritual ideals, should I say, and this is destructive inertia. You see the need for a spiritual life, but you find the afflictions much more attractive. So you want to practice the Dharma, but you love going out drinking or doing drugs and that. Too much to stop. you're trying to be in the Sangha, but you can't let go of your resentments maybe towards someone there, and it drives you away from the Sangha. There's a kind of mild form of this would be sitting down to meditate, but finding the hindrance, especially in my case, sense desire, too attractive to give them up. You just won't let go of the attractiveness of the hindrance as you meditate. So it's an important point when we're not trying to develop and maintain the positives. We are in a state of inertia. We are, in a sense, being lazy. So the absence of ardor is necessarily the presence of inertia. So if there's no ardor there, we are in the presence of inertia. And that this isn't meant to make us feel guilty or that. It sets out the challenge that we should sort of really aspire to rise to. And we need to sort of pinpoint our tendencies towards inertia, whichever one of these is most prevalent, and like prevalent for us at any particular time. And we will have ones that we do at different times. So I have questions for you. Maybe just pause for a while, and I need to pause. Are we particularly prone to any of these first three types of inertia? Actually, I'm going to share the screen, and so you can see them. So are we particularly prone to any one of these first three types of inertia? So just reflecting on that, which of these first three types of inertia that I talked about are we prone to?
Maitrikaya, we can't see your screen at the moment.
I mustn't have said. Thanks, Katie. Helps when you press share. Now, so are we particularly prone to any of the first three types of inertia? And again, at the same time, we would be particularly prone to any of the second three types of inertia. And what circumstances do we tend to fall short in our efforts and fall prey to our particular sort of favourite form of inertia? And you could, if you have pen and paper handy beside you, I don't want you to go off and get it, but if you happen to have it beside you, you could write this down. And do we get ardor, so this virya, this energy in pursuit of the good, from the desire to close the gap between ourselves and enlightenment? So whatever enlightenment means to you, it's going to mean different things to different people, depending on where they are on the path. And what does this feel like? So putting these things into words or even concepts can help us to connect with it a bit better. And seeing how we actually are, how our mind actually works. Can help us to maneuver that tanker, if you like, because it doesn't happen overnight. It's like trying to turn a big tanker, trying to change our mind, or trying to sort of work with our mind. So So we need to cultivate ardour itself. Like it doesn't, like it can arise, but we do need, even if it does arise, we need to cultivate it. And that usually involves strongly something called the four right efforts. So we need to eradicate arisen negative states. So negative states that have arisen. So whether it's craving, whether it's hatred, we need to sort of eradicate them. Okay, so that's the first of the four right efforts. We need to eradicate already arisen negative states. We can't move on until we eradicate, until we deal with, till we transform already arisen negative states. And then we have to prevent the arising of unarisen negative states. So we have to be watchful of what's going on in their mind and stop these negative states arising. So this usually starts around the hindrances. So we do this in our meditation practice. I'll say a bit more about this. So then we need to cultivate the arising of unarisen positive mental states. So we need to look in our experience for positive mental states. And then once we've noticed positive mental states, we need to maintain already arisen positive mental states. So this is how we sort of begin to cultivate ardour. And then we can look at the traditional accounts of ardour. So there are different sort of accounts of ardour. So firstly, there's protective ardour. So it's traditionally sort of the language that's traditionally used, the ardour that arrays one in armour. So this is what protects you against our tendencies for drifting off into unskillful states. So this corresponds to the first two of the four right efforts. So eradicating those already arisen negative states and preventing the arising of the unarisen negative states. So it's quite a military metaphor, isn't it? Like it's indicating that we are, in a sense, at war with these in the spiritual life. So it requires time, it requires effort, it requires determination, and even sort of spiritual bloodshed at times. So yeah, it's not just sitting back and letting things happen. We need to put in the effort. We need to put in the time. We usually talk about putting in the time on the cushion, and there is a sense of determination, and it can be hard work at times. And that's usually why we sort of give in to the inertia, because it can be hard work. Secondly, there's the ardour of applied effort. So cultivating and maintaining positive states. So sometimes we tend to put up with a lower state of consciousness than what's possible for us. So we inhabit lower states of consciousness than's possible for us. And with a little effort, we could vastly improve our state of mind. But we just sort of, through this inertia, through lack of ardour, we just inhabit these lower sort of realms of the mind, if you like. So we might get a sense of very refined states we can get into in meditation, but we can get close to these in the world outside of meditation too, if we have the ardour for it. But we usually don't try. We allow ourselves to get caught up in the negative mental states. We allow ourselves to get caught up in the conditions that cause these negative mental states to arise. So this ardour is having a zest and a zeal, if you like, to develop an ever deepening positive states of mind, so ever deepening positive mental states. But it's about seeing the refined states of mind in meditation, and then seeing them outside of meditation too, in however we do that, and then sort of having the ardour to try and keep that going. Thirdly, there's this called undaunted ardour. So the ardour that does not despair. So this is the direct opposite of this inertia of self-excuse that I talked about. So we take full responsibility for ourselves. A lot of the spiritual life is about taking responsibility for ourselves. And in a sense, essentially with this, it's a vow to ourselves really to improve things. So we're undaunted by the scale of the sort of the job, if you like, in front of us, of the job of transformation in front of us, because we can see how we need to improve, the things we need to improve, but sort of being undaunted by that, because just seeing the sort of, the Buddha talked about seeing beings with just a little dust in their eyes. That's why he thought he could see. But just seeing that a little dust has fallen from our eyes, and that we can sort of open our eyes fully and see and change. When we first step on the path, it's usually because life is causing us what we call dukkha. We can see the unsatisfactoriness. That's why I'm here, and it's why most people I know come to a Buddha center in the first place, come to meditation in the first place, because they can see the unsatisfactoriness of life. It's not that sometimes people say, they say like dukkha, this word dukkha is suffering. But it is suffering, but it's unsatisfactoriness. We can see that life doesn't give us happiness all the time. And we can see that in the impermanent nature of it. Like we talked about this, like the fact that we lose people, we lose things, we see like the shininess goes off romantic relationships, the shininess goes off the new car, the shininess goes off the new phone. And that causes us suffering in a sense, but we see the unsatisfactoriness. So the first step on the path is usually because we see that life is causing us dukkha. We see the unsatisfactoriness of dukkha, of life, should I say. And we can have naive expectations of the Sangha to be different, and that everything will be easier from here on in. And often the Sangha does, the spiritual community does make things better, and things do get better, but there's still conflict. Like, people are people, and there's still conflict in the Sangha and between people. And at times the Dharma life can be hard. It is hard work transforming. I'm not trying to put people off, but like sometimes it's we come up against difficulties within ourselves, and sometimes it's we can think, oh, this is too much for me, or we can feel that we're not really changing. We can't see, like, we're too close up against it, and we can't see the change in ourselves. Sometimes it takes other people. That's why the whole idea of community is important, because other people can see the change in us much more clearly than we can, because we're too close up. It's too, like, it's here, and people can't see it, or we can't see it, but other people can. So we can feel that we're not really changing despite our years of practice even. So, and disorder is the opposite of this. So it's very necessary to have this, especially in an age which expects instant gratification and instant results. So everything is like, I get it now, like, yeah. But that's, when the going gets tough, we have the resources, the ardor to deal with it, and not to turn back from the challenge of the spiritual life. So fifthly, there's idealistic ardor. The ardor that's never satisfied. So we refuse to let rest on our laurels. Oh yeah, so I'm getting into sort of like, I'm nice and calm, my life is going pretty good, but it's sort of, we don't rest on our laurels and stop and say, oh, this is enough and no further. Like, so it's continued, this ardor continually helps us to keep driving on, to try and develop deeper and deeper positive mental states. We see that we can sort of inhabit better realms, if you like. So this is kind of serious, because we can, after difficulties in life, come to the Dharma for relief. Again, most of us, that's why we do, because we recognize the unsatisfactory nature of life, and we come to the Dharma for relief. And we do get some relief and humanity again. And then we can think, this is enough. We don't need the Dharma anymore. A sense of papering over the cracks in our life. So we get a nice smooth walls around our life. And we say, oh, we don't need the Dharma anymore. And then we drift away, particularly into romance and the like, until the next crisis happens. And then the cracks appear again, as they do. It's the nature of life. So in some ways, we need to keep striving and never be fully satisfied with our attainments. So there's one form, not a traditional form, that Subhuti lists. He calls it compassionate ardor. So the ardor that consists in benefiting living beings. So your practice is as much about helping all beings as yourself. So sometimes we can get sort of satisfied with ourselves, but if we take that outside of ourselves, and the metta bhavana practice is one way of sort of bringing that out of into our experience. Without this desire to help all beings, your practice can become a bit sort of self-referential and individualistic, and if we keep that sense of going out, our practice going out towards other people, it can bring a different perspective to it. It can stop us sort of like, oh, I've done enough, I'm okay, but we can never do enough for other people. So questions again. There's only two, so I'm not going to sort of write them up. Do we find any of these kinds of ardor particularly inspiring? So these few, I'll just go through them again. So, without talking all around them. So we have, first is the ardour that arrays us in armour. There's ardour of applied effort, so we're cultivating and maintaining positive mental states. The ardour that does not despair, so we just keep going. The ardour that does not turn back. The ardour that is never satisfied. And then Subhuti's compassionate ardour. So do you find any of these kinds of ardour particularly inspiring? And which one do you think that you maybe need to cultivate? And maybe we could open up chat if anybody is brave enough to open up their soul, so to speak, and put it into chat. Right, yeah, Tom, being bloody minded is not always a bad thing. Sometimes we think that is being sort of a negative thing, but it's not. It's just being bloody minded about ourselves, just sort of pushing forward with it, like.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Yeah. For me, the ardor to never stop, that's very inspiring. It sounds to me like what the Buddha would have, that natural flow, like a river of ardor, you know, always flowing, always progressing. That's very inspiring. And the compassion one, it's very inspiring. And I think the Sangha for me is the biggest source of compassion, because I'm learning to be compassionate to myself now and been practicing for a short while, so I'm not great at it yet, but it's excellent to have a community that their ultimate goal is to be open-heartedly compassionate, you know. So for me, those two are the most inspiring, and I think I need to practice them all. Really. What you said about where there is no ardor, there is stagnation is not the word. What's the word again? Inertia.
Inertia.
Yeah.
Talking about stagnation after the break.
Okay. That was for me, that was almost like, ooh, okay, that's true. And I was not really aware of it. And so I don't think I have ardor all the time. There is loads of space for more. That's it for me.
Thanks, Carol. That Emer just said too, the ardour of self-compassion, to work with criticism and judgment. Yeah, that's important too. Like, you know, that Subhuti didn't point that out, but like that is very important. Like, you know, to turn that on ourselves as well. Like. But this ardour, like, you know, like if we are cultivating all this ardour, we are like Carol was saying, we are effectively behaving like a Buddha. It's like if we have, because it is a continuum. Like ultimately, we're closing this gap between ourselves and enlightenment. So, like the Buddha would behave with all this ardour. Or operate with all this ardour, same thing, I So shall we take a break? So we take a 10-minute break, and we'll come back at 11:45 for. Okay, so what we're going to look at now is one of the words that Carol mentioned, stagnation, but serenity and stagnation. So stagnation is sthana, and it's the direct opposite of this other word, serenity, prasadati. So stagnation is often called sloth, and it's one of the 5 hindrances to meditation. So that stagnation is more specific than inertia. It's a kind of emotional stiffness or even depression, and it has 3 symptoms. So it's a lack of physical energy, a feeling of heaviness that makes it seem wearisome or to move. It's a lack of ardour, so one feels spiritually stuck and without genuine enthusiasm for the ideal. And it's a lack of mental pliancy, so the mind is dull and rigid and unable to respond to what's in front of it. So in stagnation, you don't take in what people say. You can't sort of direct your thoughts, you can't marshal your thoughts effectively, and you can't make decisions. So it resembles being sleepy. I think we've all sort of with examples of being in lectures or being in classes or that where we're just too tired to take in information, like at the end of a long day. We haven't slept properly the night before, and we just can't take in the information. The information is just too much for us. But this is something different. This resembles sleepiness, but it's actually a dull unresponsiveness to whatever situation that we find ourselves in. And it can simply be caused by lack of physical exercise. In that case, it's really easy to cure. Just a matter of going out and having a walk. But it can lie much deeper than this too. It can be a product of some sort of inner conflict. So your energies are divided. You can't put your energies into things. Everyone experiences themselves as divided at one time or another. But here it's a palpable affliction where your energies get locked up in conflict with each other. It becomes sort of self-perpetuating, like some sort of perpetual motion machine, really. The more you suffer from it, the less you feel like doing anything. So you get sort of caught up in this, like I said, it's a perpetual motion machine. So, for instance, within sort of our community, it's a really important thing when someone gets invited to be ordained. So, example, feeling happy for someone when you hear that they'll be invited on an ordination retreat, but at the same time unable to rejoice in them because you feel very jealous about that and think it should have been you. So you're locked into sort of saying nothing. You just can't you can't express yourself because you feel happy in one sense, but then again you're sort of you're not happy because you're jealous. So it's it's that type of two parts of you in conflict with each other. So you freeze up. So I'm sure you all have your own examples of this. So your own examples of this that you can call on, where you can find yourself, you have found yourself, or you can find yourself in conflict, two parts of yourself in conflict with each other. Serenity then is the opposite of stagnation. In its pure form, it's a very lofty mental event. And it's only really, like we talked about the dhyanas before, it's only really experiencing the third dhyana, which is like that's quite a lofty mental state to be in. But there are more regular aspects of it too. First, at the physical level, it involves feeling a lightness and ease. So the body becoming very light and free of tension. And we can feel this quite easily in meditation, but not just in meditation. Rather than experience oneself as a hard, like of all hard muscle and bone, one is aware of oneself very energetically. I remember, like I practiced Tai Chi as a martial art for 12 years. And I very much a sense of most of my time, I had this sense in my body of feeling this sort of serenity in my body, this lack of stagnation in my body, feeling this energy, physical energy in my body, a lightness of being, if you like, in my body. I know when I do yoga, after the yoga, I can feel it in my body. I still do some qigong. When I do qigong, I can feel that energy. So physical exercise, the right physical exercise can do it. We can feel oneself very energetically. We can feel the energy flowing through our body. But secondly, at the mental level, serenity is a state of calmness and composure. So inner tensions and the opposites that hold back the flow of our energies seem to dissolve. And the place that I've most found this is within the sort of, even at the sort of state of access concentration, at the early stage as the dhyanas are developing in meditation. So the sense of our energies flowing and unifying, and they're flowing more and more in a single current. So it's like all the river is flowing in the one direction. So it's deep and it's full and it's very satisfying. So energy can be released, and this is experienced as pretty, rapture. And it's very pleasurable and experience. So it's like we feel that in our body. We feel this. So there's a physical sense to it too. It's like we have the mental serenity, the calmness and composure, but the energy that's released by that is actually felt in the body. We feel the sort of ripples in our body from it. And any of you who have felt it will know how pleasurable it is. Thirdly, there's a mental pliancy and adaptability. So there's no sense of the stiffness of fixed attitudes and opinions, of dullness that comes from this inner conflict again. So the mind is more elastic and more open and more flexible. And this kind of pliancy is essential, if we're going to reflect and achieve any sense of penetrative wisdom. And to some extent, this, back again to Blake's sort of couplet, like about kissing the joy as it flies and living in eternity sunrise, this way of living for me leaves me more open to having this sort of mental pliancy and adaptability, of being able to sort of sit in reflection and being able to sort of at least start to have this penetrative wisdom. So again, more questions for you. Do you experience stagnation in your life? And is it a lack of physical energy? Is it a lack of ardor, of virya, of this energy in pursuit of the good. Or is it a lack of this mental pliancy? Or is it even a mix of all three? And can you understand? Do you have any understanding of what underlies it? So is there some sort of internal conflict going on? I'm just turning the coin over now. Do you experience serenity? And is it at a physical level? Is it at a mental level? Or is it in the form of this mental pliancy and adaptability? Okay, so let's move on. So let's have a look at the equanimity, restlessness, and distraction. So equanimity, upekkha, is the opposite of the two afflictions of distraction, viksepa, and restlessness. So distraction is a form of, well, it's a sort of wavering between a range of different objects. So sort of all the time hopping from one to the other. So you're never fully attending to any one thing to any great degree. So it's a symptomatic of a lack of the intensifiers, if you can remember those. So some lack of emotional engagement, but little resolve or attentiveness. So we're trying to go beyond that initial emotional engagement repeatedly breaks down. So we're any attempt to sort of move on our emotional engagement just keeps breaking down. So distraction is an active process in the mind. It's not just like lack of the intensifiers. It's a force in the mind that scatters the mind. So a mechanism that disperses attention. And it's not something that just happens to us. It's not something that like something that's being done externally to us or something that comes in. It's something that we like actively do. So we seek out as a strategy, we seek it out as a strategy for avoiding an uncomfortable confrontation with the way things are. So for example, people getting very distracted when they have to face up to an uncomfortable truth. So something comes up in our meditation practice. Maybe we've been unskillful or something. I think the classic one, and it's something that has come up for me. So I've been untruthful about something, and I've sat down to meditate, and like I've gotten to a level of concentration, and when we do that, things, well, in my experience, things start to bubble up, and the fact that, like, okay, I said something to someone and it wasn't quite truthful, and I'm going to have to sort of see this person and involved another person, and the truth will out, as it always does when we're not truthful. The truth will out, and this causes so we seek something and we try and avoid this uncomfortable confrontation in the mind, and so we get into this sort of distractive, like we distract ourselves from the sort of the discomfort of the confrontation with our own sort of mental state. So I hope you get that. I hope you can see what I'm talking about. So we cause something because of our sort of, well, in this case, because of our unskillfulness, and we suffer the karmic consequences really when we sit down to meditate, and then because we don't want to deal with it, we just distract. We distract ourselves. So it's an active process in the mind, just to get away from the uncomfortable confrontation. So restlessness is also an active force, but it's slightly different to distraction. Distraction means sort of instability in one's choice of object. So you jump from one person to another when you're trying to pick someone in the Metta Bhavana, for instance. That's really easy to do. You just sort of, like, there's a really good way of distracting yourself. Like, oh, I'm bored with them. Oh, I'll move on to the next person. Oh, I know, I'll pick them instead. And it's really easy to do, and it's a really great way, if there is a great way of being distracted. Restlessness really is an instability in the nature of your relationship to the chosen object. So you can't focus on the person you picked, and your attention keeps getting disturbed by restlessness. In restlessness, you constantly think different things about the object. So instead of focusing on the sense of metta for the person, you might get into whole storylines about the person. Like, you can sort of go on one line, then you go on another track. So you're still staying with the person, but like you're going off piste, so to speak. You're not really keeping with a sense of meta, with a sense of cultivating a sense of wishing them well. And this is a manifestation. Restlessness is really a manifestation of craving. The mind can't settle because it's urgently looking for some pleasurable aspect in the object. So it's a restless and an excitable hunger for pleasure, really, but without knowing where it's to be found. So it's one of the 5 hindrances. So it's sense desire, really. So it's associated with sense desire, which causes this restlessness. So restlessness is much more difficult to recognize than distraction, because it doesn't flit around between objects, and so it's more subtle. So distraction, we're just going around like flying around the place, but like restlessness doesn't do that. It's much more subtle. So you can sit for hours in a state of restless fascination with some plan or idea that when you're actually supposed to be meditating. My classic one was, I spent an hour in the Buddha Center one morning many years ago, designing a collapsible shrine in my head. I didn't want to do what I was doing. Now I'm neither a designer or could I construct the thing. But I spent a whole hour designing this thing in my head. I don't know what was going on that I wanted to get away from, but I wanted to get away from something. I didn't want to sort of deal with something. So mine was like some sort of cross between distraction and restlessness. But I spent the whole hour involved in this design of this collapsible shrine, just lost in fascination with it, like, yeah. So it's another one, like I remember Vajrashura telling me about this one, and a solitary was on the planning for a new Buddhist business, like similar to what I did. Like, you just get into the whole fantasy world of planning something. The problem with restlessness is compounded by the anticipation of pleasure. So like, if I produce this, like this collapsible Buddhist shrine, like, think of all the praise I get and the pleasure I get from doing this. And the same with Vajrashura, with this new shiny Buddhist business. So you may feel like you're enjoying this state of restlessness. And most of our sort of what we get from pleasure is the anticipation of the pleasurable event rather than the actual immediate pleasure. A lot of the pleasure I feel that comes from things is the anticipation of it rather than the actual initial pleasure at all. So you may be producing one idea after another, looking at it from one angle and then the other. And conceit may also arise because you're so intoxicated with your own brilliance of mind. And that's what was happening with me. I could do it for a whole hour because, oh look, aren't I very clever? I can do this in my mind. Like. So restlessness then is an all unenlightened minds to some extent. We all have it. The unenlightened mind, all unenlightened minds have it to some extent. So being restless is a state of turbulence, and we must learn to recognize this turbulence as soon as it arises, so that we don't spend an hour doing it. We can sort of cut it off. Just remember that it's unskillful and try and work with it. So to some extent there are physical symptoms, such as the rising of energy into the head, which if I had noticed I could have stopped. There's a tingling in the limbs, a growing sense of excited energy, for instance. So we must work to stabilize the mind to counter both the distraction and the restlessness. And the mindfulness of breathing is one of the main counters to distraction. So the metta bhavana helps to subdue restlessness by developing a consistent attitude towards a wide range of objects, all living beings. So this is an attitude that is detached from the egoistic search for pleasure. So we can sort of cultivate that in our metta bhavana practice, and we can cultivate this sense of lack of distraction in our mindfulness of breathing practice by keep coming back to the breath the whole time. But more generally, we try to unify our life around a solid purpose and meaning. And we sort of eliminate opportunities for being diverted from that. So more questions. So which are we more affected by in our meditation? Is it distraction or is it restlessness for you? And is there a difference outside meditation? Like, are you more affected by distraction or restlessness outside meditation? Because it doesn't stop. Like our mind, we meditate with the same mind. We live our life with the same mind. And are these linked? And do we see restlessness as a hindrance all of the time? Do we actually see that as a hindrance? So what strategies do you employ to counter distraction and restlessness? Okay, so I want to look at equanimity now. So equanimity is used in many senses in Buddhism. It's a very broad meaning word. But the way we're using it here in this context is that it manifests very strongly in, like we talked about the dhyanas again, in the fourth dhyana. So this is the most refined mental state we can get into meditation. So it's not a bland. Sometimes we think of equanimity as some sort of bland neutrality. So yeah, we're just sort of not sort of almost like Teflon people. Things just bounce off us and we're not really sort of engaging with anything. But it's much more than that. Equanimity is like, if you like, a lofty happiness. So, but that goes beyond pleasure and pain, and even beyond sorrow and joy. So we're not affected by, in the same way a Buddha is not affected by these things. We still feel pain, but because we have a fix, the Buddha still had a human body, so of course, like, and as he got older, he still had pain. He had pain in his body, like he died of food poisoning, so he had still pain as he was dying, but he wasn't affected by it. That's the whole thing with equanimity, that we're not affected by the. Well, I'm going to teach a course next called the worldly winds. We're not affected by the worldly winds that blow us around. So fame and infamy, pleasure and pain, sorrow and joy. We're not affected by these things. It's a calm that's so profound that it makes ordinary happiness to some extent seem troublesome, because ordinary happiness is sort of dependent on things, it's dependent on people, it's dependent on having things, it's dependent on having people in a sense. So this is equanimity is unconnected with that. It's a complete serene and skillful state, free of even the slightest bit of agitation or excitement. But we're talking about the sort of I'm talking about it in terms of the fourth dhyana, and there aren't many of us who are getting into the fourth dhyana all the time. So it might feel like that. Oh, we're talking about sort of lofty states of mind that none of us can experience, but we can taste it before we get near the fourth dhyana. We can sort of, whenever we're in a state of non-reactivity. And like many of us, any of us can get into that state of non-reactivity. And we can encounter this when we meet without craving or hatred. But we're alive to whatever is there. When we're touching into equanimity. So we're not sort of, we're not grasping after something or pushing something away. Then we can touch into equanimity. And when you just keep your cool in a difficult situation, difficult circumstances, then we're touching into equanimity. So equanimity is order, so this energy after the good, combined with contentment, goodwill and clarity. So there are 3 levels of equanimity. So this is what the Abhidharma does. It breaks down things into very, very fine sort of points so we can really get at them. So the first there is the equanimity of the balanced mind. So here you have balance, but it's quite a bit of effort to maintain it. So you have to constantly make the effort because your mind naturally slips back into turbulence. Like if we look at our minds as our normal minds, our minds are quite turbulent. They're constantly, there's stuff going on constantly. That's why meditation practice is so important, because then we can really see the turbulent nature of our mind. So we can see that we have to make this effort because our mind naturally slips back into turbulence, but with effort we can maintain some sense of balance. Secondly, there's the equanimity of the mind at rest. So the mind steadies itself in this state of balance without the same great effort needed previously to maintain it. And we can see this successively in the dhyanas, just as we get into sort of more refined states of mind. So you start just having to make little adjustments here and there when difficulties arise. Thirdly, there's the equanimity of the spontaneous mind. So you don't have to make any effort at all. You're spontaneously equanimous. Quite naturally, you lack any emotional engagement with unskillful things. That's the whole point of it. We don't emotionally engage with unskillful things. So nothing can shake our balance. And we really need to start developing equanimity to drive out distraction and restlessness. When we experience distraction, it's helpful to think in terms of actively cultivating equanimity. And when we experience restlessness, we need to recognize this for what it is and what it's not. It's unskillful and it's unhelpful. And it's not a state that is pleasant and inspired. And we should allow ourselves to try and detach from it and experience boredom if necessary with this restlessness. And from this, a more lovely, if you like, equanimity can emerge. So equanimity can also counter other afflictions such as hatred and envy. So we start to let go of our hatred. We can let go of our resentment. We can let go of our envy. So another couple of questions for you to ponder for a moment. Where do you experience equanimity? Do we have any experience of the different levels of equanimity? So this equanimity of the balanced mind, this equanimity of a mind at rest, or this equanimity of a spontaneous mind. So with all of these afflictions, so our inertia, or stagnation, or restlessness, or distraction, we'll experience the greatest success when we're able to bring the mind back to the corresponding positives. So of the three, order is the most important. Without it, we wouldn't be able to take the step necessary to develop the serenity and then the equanimity. So for most of us, order is where we really need to work. That's where we need to start. That's where most of us really need to do the work. And this may mean going back to faith again and trying to develop this. So for order is in a sense simply faith raised to a level. And in faith to this, I'm not talking, I presume you know, I'm not talking about blind faith. I'm talking about confidence that the practice works. And we can see that in our own experience. That's why I presume most of us are here, because we have some confidence that practice works. So it's faith raised to a level where it's strong enough to move and change us. But in the end, it means being conscious of what effort means in our own experience. And that's going to mean different things for for each of us. And recognizing and detecting within ourselves both the ardor and its enemy, inertia. So we need to see what's working against the ardor. We need to see how the inertia works against the ardor and trying to sort of counteract that. So there's been a lot there this morning. So I'll share my screen again. Well, I will when I... Right. Now, so a home practice for this week. I think it's really important that, like this stuff this morning was fairly dense, so it's important that you read the notes, and if you are reading the book, that you reflectively read the book. So focus this week on recognizing each of the mental states that we've been discussing in the class and that are in the notes, in your own experience, because like we can't discuss them or you can't sort of recognize them in the abstract. You have to recognize them in your own experience and get into the habit of watching these aspects of the mind in your daily life, particularly focusing on cultivating ardor, so this energy after the good, but like not sort of too much emphasis on the energy aspect. So to being aware of its opposite to this inertia. And ardor, as I said, is the most important of the positives that we discussed this week, and it's where we would it's worth spending time upon it, especially focusing on those 4 right efforts I talked about, and noticing which of the types of inertia that we fall into and which type of ardor might be a good antidote for it. And there are some sort of meditation reflections in the notes that you might like to follow. Now there's a lot there. There's a lot of reading. There's a lot of reflection. So that is it for this week. We've a couple of 1 minute left. If anybody has any comments they want to make, or any, well, we don't have a lot of time for questions, but if there's anything, comments anybody wants to make. Carol's phone seems to have died or is dying, so she's gone.
Thanks, Maitrikaya.
Thanks for a great morning. Loads of stuff for reflection.
Thank you. It's very thought-provoking, and I feel a week is never quite enough to go through it in enough depth and practice it enough in between the classes. I'm going to do the whole thing over again when it's ended, on my own, to try and get to the grips with it all.
Oh yeah, no, it's actually it's a life work really. We're only sort of scratching the surface of it here, really. It's definitely not. It's definitely not a long enough time.
Thank you very much. Thank you. There's so much food for thought there. It would be nice to have maybe a study group when the course is over, just to rethink these things and to make some progress with them. So if anyone's interested, we'll see about it. Thank you.
Well, Atulia Mitra is the woman to talk to about women's study groups.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So have a good week, everybody, and we'll see you next week for week 6.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Maitrikaya.
Maitrikaya. Bye-bye, everybody.
Enjoy the sun, because that's where I'm going.
Yeah.
Take care.
Bye-bye.